So, in many parts of Asia, there is a time called the Hungry Ghost Month. It happens once a year during the seventh month of the lunar calendar, when people believe that the gates of the underworld open and spirits of the dead are free to walk among the livings. To keep them calm, families leave food outside of their homes, along with offerings of incense and paper objects. These paper offerings can be anything, from money, houses, clothes, and even dolls. They are burned so the spirits can use them in the afterlife. But there are also rules. Do not mock the offerings, do not step on the offerings, and never treat them as trash. People say breaking these rules is like opening the door for the spirits themselves. So tonight, you will hear 3 stories about what happens when these rules are broken. And the first begins in a quiet alleyway where a man laughed at what he thought was just paper. That night, he learned that even ash can also have a face. The stories start at one night where it was close to midnight when 4 friends decided to take a shortcut home from school. Instead of following the main street, they decided to turn into an alleyway that was narrow and quiet. The ground was uneven and the walls on either side rose high enough to trap the shadows. Halfway down, they saw 2 wire bins standing against the wall. Inside them were the remains of offerings that had been burned earlier that evening to offer to the ghosts and the spirits during the Hungry Ghost Month. The ashes were still warm and there were faint smoke twisting upward in the dark. Among the ash were shapes that had not fully turned to dust. They were folded paper figures with stiff bodies and painted faces that looked flat but also strangely realistic. These were paper dolls burned during the Hungry Ghost Month, where families sometimes burned them as servants or companions for the dead. So spirits will also help and also comfort in the afterlife. It is not unusual to see them in alleyways during this time. While most people would just walk quietly past them, however, these friends decided to slow down their steps. The air smelled faintly of smoke and sweet fruits from earlier offerings, and though none of them said it out loud, they all felt like the alley changed the moment they saw the dolls. One of them muttered, "Let's just keep going," but another one inside their group decided that he had different plans. He had this smile on his face and decided to step in closer to look. He leaned over the bin and staring down at the paper dolls that had not been burned fully. One was folded into a shape of a man with its face painted with careful black lines. The ash had eaten away parts of its chest, but the head was still intact. He nudged it with a toe of his shoes. The paper bent inward, folding the painted face in half. "See," he said, "it's just a paper. People take this way too seriously." The others shifted uncomfortably. One of them whispered that it was not the right thing to do, and that you shouldn't touch what was meant for the spirits. Everyone knew the spirits and the offerings are not toys to play with, and that mocking them could lead to bad luck. But he only laughed and gave the doll another kick, scattering the ashes across the ground. No one said anything for a moment, but the alley felt heavier, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "Let's just go," another friend said quickly. "Please don't mess with it." The one who kicked the doll shrugged it off and waved them off, acting as if nothing had happened. He turned his back on the bin and walked ahead. None of them noticed how the paper faces left and the ash seemed to lean upward, their flat eyes reflecting the faintest glow, following the group as they left the alleyway. Later that night, when the one who kicked the paper doll arrived at home, when the house was quiet and the city outside had gone still, he sat in his room scrolling through his phone. The laughter from the alleyway was already a distant memory. He told himself again that it was just a paper, nothing to worry about. And then at that moment, he heard something, a faint sound right by the window. It wasn't just a knock. It was not the creak of a pipe. It was the sound of long, thin scratching, slow and deliberate, as if someone was dragging the edge of something across the glass. He froze, listening. His room was on the third floor. There were no trees outside. No way anyone could be standing there. But the sound came again. The sound of scratching. Pause, and then scratching again. His heart beat faster. He whispered under his breath that it must be the wind. The air outside was still, and the sound was too steady. It was intentional. It was not random. It felt like someone is trying to get into his apartment and trying to get his attention. He pulled the curtain aside quickly. His reflection stared back at him, pale and in the glass. Behind it was only darkness. Nothing else. No branches, no figure, no reason for the sound at all. The scratching suddenly stopped the moment he looked. The silence was heavy, and for the first time that night, he thought of the paper doll that he had kicked in the ash. The following night, he tried not to think about it. He told himself that he had imagined the sound, but when the clock had not even reached midnight, the same sound came back. But this time, it was not at the window. It was actually on the wall. A slow tracking sound, softer than nails but rougher than cloth. It moved across the paint near his bed, steady and unhurried. He turned on the light and his breath was sharp and looked around. There were marks on the wall, black smudges with thin lines that streaked across the surface like someone had dragged dirty finger along it. He stepped closer and he noticed that the stain looked like ash, the same kind that he had seen falling from the paper doll the night before. His stomach tightened. He rubbed the marks with his sleeve and some of the powder came off on the fabric of his shirt. The same smell that he recognized. The smell was faint but familiar. The same burnt, papery smell that hung in the alleyway that night. He stepped back, staring at the wall. He didn't know what to think. Maybe it was someone trying to play a trick on him. But his door was closed. He was alone in his apartment, and even the window was closed. Everything had been closed all night. And then suddenly, the sound started again, faint and steady as if something unseen was brushing against the wall. Even while he stood there watching, he backed away quickly and turned every light in the apartment on, trying to drown out the thought growing in his mind. The thought of something was following him from the alleyway that night. He couldn't stay in the bedroom any longer. The marks on the wall made him feel like the space itself had turned against him. So he went to the living room, switched on the ceiling light and sat on the sofa with the television running low. Anything just to break the silence. And for a moment, nothing happened. He told himself he had overreacted. The stains on the wall could be explained, and the scratching could be ignored. But as he glanced towards the display cabinet by the corner, his heart sank. The glass on the cabinet didn't show just his reflection anymore. It looked crowded, and behind his own pale face were shapes, flat, painted faces, and they have this big, creepy smiles on their faces, and their eyes were simple black dots, but they seemed to follow him no matter where he moved. They were the faces of the paper dolls. He stepped closer, hoping it was just a trick of light, maybe fingerprints or smudges on the glass. But as he leaned in, one of the faces shifted slightly, its painted smile tilting just enough to make it look alive. He stumbled back with this shocked look in his face. He remembered the paper doll from the alley, their bodies folded and their faces painted in black ink. He remembered the way that he had kicked one into the ash, and now, here they are, watching him from the inside of his home through the reflection of the cabinet. He leaned against the locked door, trying to steady his breath, and told himself he was safe inside his apartment. But when he turned back towards the living room, the word froze in his throat. They were already there. 3 figures stood in the room, motionless, as if they had been standing there all along. They were paper dolls, life-size, stiff, with edges curled from the fire. Their painted faces were simple and flat, yet In the dim light, they seemed almost alive. Their hands hung at their side and bent at odd angles as if they had been folded too many times. Their heads tilted forward slightly, like masks balancing on thin sticks. They didn't move quickly. They didn't have to. They were watching him, waiting in silence as if they knew he had nowhere left to run. He tried to convince himself that he was just imagining things. Maybe the smoke from the offerings had made him dizzy. Maybe the faces on the glass had tricked his mind. But the air around them was heavy and the faint smell of burnt paper filled the room again, and the same scent he thought he had left behind in the alleyway. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean it. I didn't know." The dolls did not answer. They only stood there with their painted eyes unblinking. He felt the weight of their silence pressing down on him, making the room colder with each breath. One of the dolls slowly lifted its hand. The movement was stiff, like paper bending. A black flake of ash broke away from its painted fingers and drifted to the floor. It landed softly by his shoes, leaving a small mark on the tiles. He stared at it, and his chest felt tightened. He thought of all the warnings that he had heard growing up but never taken seriously. That offerings in the alleyway are not meant to be touched. That spirits can be angered if you disturb what is theirs. He realized that it was not just superstition, it was protection, and he had ignored it. His voice cracked as he repeated the words, "I'm sorry, please, I won't do it again." But the dolls stayed silent, their stiff forms filling the room with a presence that was heavier than the words. He did not sleep for the rest of that night. He sat on the sofa with every light in the apartment turned on, his eyes fixed on the spot where the dolls had stood. And at some point, he blinked and then they were gone. The room was empty again and the smell of burnt paper had faded, and the ash still lay by his shoes as proof that it had not been a dream. When the first hint of dawn reached his window, he knew what he had to do. He gathered a small bundle of joss sticks, a lighter, and whatever fruit that he could find in his kitchen. His hands shook as he packed everything into a plastic bag and hurried to the alley where it all began. The wire bin was still there, filled with the remains of last night's offerings. The faint outline of the paper dolls could still be seen. He set the fruit down carefully and bowed his head 3 times and lit the joss sticks. The smoke rose straight and thin, curling into the morning air. He whispered an apology, his voice low and uneven, and then he pulled out a fresh stack of money paper that he had bought from a nearby shop and set it on fire inside the bin. The flames caught quickly, eating the paper until it turned black and drifted into ash. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. He only kept his head lowered, waiting for the last of the smoke faded into the sky. Only then did he gather all of his things and walked home. His steps were quick, and he never dared to look back down at the alleyway again. That night, his apartment was quiet again. The walls were clean and no new marks appeared, and the glass reflected only his own tired face. He sat on his bed with the lamp still burning and told himself that he would never take that shortcut again. And the image of the paper dolls standing in his room would not leave his mind, but at least they were gone for now. He thought of what he had done, mocking an offering that was not his to touch. He realized then that the rituals were not about superstitions or fear. They were about respect for the dead, and for the space between their world and our world. He finally lay down, and his body was heavy with exhaustion. Sleep came slowly, but without scratching, without faces in the glass, without shadows standing at the edge of his bed. And every time he thought about taking a shortcut home, he remembered the image of the paper doll standing in his room. Because during the Hungry Ghost Month, even something made out of ash and folded paper can find its way back to you if you don't show it respect. And that, everyone, is the end of our first story. Now, let's move on to our second story, which is about a performer, A performance, I would say, that happens rarely, but often during the Hungry Ghost Month. During this month, it is common to see temporary stages built in open fields, car parks, or street corners, I would say. These performances are called Getai, with bright, loud shows that meant to entertain the living, but also the spirits who wander freely during this time. The rule is simple. The front row of seats must always be left empty, and they are not meant for us, the living humans. One evening, a young singer was preparing for his performance. The crowd had not yet gathered, and the stage lights cast pale circles on the rows of plastic chairs set neatly in front of the stage. The first row stood out. They were perfectly arranged, but also untouched. He had grown up seeing this tradition, but never thought much of it. To him, it was only an old custom, a detail to make the festival more colorful. He stood backstage, humming to warm up his voice, and stared at the empty chairs. He thought they looked strange, waiting in silence like that. Strange enough that he wanted a picture. He decided to pull out his phone and lifted it up towards the chairs in the front row. Without a further thought, he took a picture of the front row of the seat in front of the stage of the performance. He joked to his friends that he will take a picture of the full house before the show even starts. His laughter was light and careless. He tapped the screen and the shutter clicked again. The chairs looked ordinary enough, just red plastic, lined up in straight rows. But as he lowered the phone, the air around him shifted slightly, making him feel colder than it had been a moment ago. The stagehand gave him a sharp look, as if he wanted to say something but stopped himself. The singer slipped the phone into his pocket and brushed it off. Just another harmless picture, he thought. He didn't notice how the shadows in the front row lingered longer than the others, as if something unseen was already sitting there, waiting for the show to begin when he took the photo. The performance began soon after, and the crowd gathered, filling the back rows with chatter and the hum of the conversation, while the empty front row still remained untouched, exactly as the tradition required. The singer took his place on stage, bowing lightly before the beginning of his set. His voice carried the night air, cheerful in practice, and the audience clapped politely between songs. When the break came, he stepped off the stage and sat in a small tent behind the curtain. With sweat clinging to his face, and he reached for his phone to check the photo that he had taken earlier. He scrolled through his gallery until the picture appeared, and the moment he saw it, his stomach dropped. The chairs in the photo, the front row, the chairs, they were not empty. Every seat in the front row was filled, not by living people, but by figures that looked flat, as though they had been cut out and placed there. They were paper dolls, seated up front with painted faces turned towards the stage. Their black-inked eyes stared directly into the lens of camera, unblinking. He blinked and looked again, hoping that it was the trick of light or a smudge on the lens. But the picture didn't change. The painted smiles, the stiff bodies, and the way that they sat so neatly in place, it was all too clear. The more he stared, the colder the air around him felt, as though the tent itself had been left out in the rain. And for the first time, he remembered the rule that he had ignored. The empty chairs were not decoration. They were reserved, and by taking that photo, he had seen something he was never meant to see. Suddenly, at that moment, the host called his name again, and he had no choice but to return to the stage. He tucked the phone into his back pocket, and his hands trembling, and stepped into the bright lights. The crowd cheered as before, though he had no comfort in their voices anymore. He forced a smile and began to sing. His voice was steady at first. It was strained by years of practice, but every time his eyes drifted towards the front row, he had to pull them away. He tried not to look at the front row because the chairs were still empty to the Schumann's eye, but the memory of that photograph clung onto his mind. He imagined the paper dolls sitting there, patient and silent, watching every move that he made. The audience in the back clapped and laughed as usual, unaware of anything strange. But to him, the silence of the front row was louder than all of the noise behind it. The empty chairs felt occupying, and though his eyes never fully met them, he knew if he dared to look too long, he might see the painted face staring back. By the time the song ended, his palms were slick with sweat. He bowed quickly and his voice trembling as he thanked the crowd. Somewhere in the middle of the applause, he thought he heard something else. Another kind of clapping. Soft, slow, and perfectly even, as though it came out of not from hands of flesh, but from something lighter, something made out of paper. The sound feels like paper are clapping onto each other. The show carried on, songs after songs and costume changes, bright lights. To the crowd, it was lively entertainment, the kind of noisy color that the Hungry Ghost Month was known for. But to him, each moment on stage felt heavier. Every time a song ended, the applause came, but something was wrong with it. The clapping from the crowd was uneven, loud in some corners, soft in others, normal, Schumann. But underneath it, he heard another rhythm, a second layer of applause that faint and yet steady, as though it came from just few people sitting close to the stage from the front row. It was too even, too controlled, no excitement, no variety, just a slow, steady pattern, like raindrops falling in perfect time on plastic. He glanced quickly towards the front row, but of course the seat looked empty. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, when he bowed, he couldn't shake the sense that something unseen was acknowledging him from those chairs in the front row. And by the third song, his hands were shaking so much he could barely hold the microphone. His voice wavered, and though the audience shared as usual, he knew something else was present, something that clapped only for him and waiting for him to sing again. That night, after the performance, he returned home exhausted. He tried to push the thought away, tried to convince himself it was just stress and imagination. He showered, ate quickly, and fell into bed without checking his phone again. But sleep did not bring peace. In his dream, he stood on stage once more, and the light so bright that they burned his eyes. The tent behind him flapped in a wind that did not exist, and the microphone in his hand felt heavier than before. The audience was silent. Rows of people sat perfectly still, their faces shadowed except for the first row. That row was filled with the same paper dolls from the photograph. Their bodies were flat, their smiles painted, and their eyes staring without blinking. He tried to sing, but no sound came out. His throat tightened, dry and sharp, as if it was filled with ash. A voice behind him, faint and low, whispered into his ear, "Keep singing. They are not done yet." The sound of clapping began again, slow and steady, rising from the first row. He woke with his heart racing and his throat burning as though he had been screaming for hours. His phone was still on the nightstand and the screen was dark. He didn't dare to turn it on again. The dream didn't end when he woke. Even in the days that followed, he felt trapped inside it. Each night he closed his eyes, and each night he found himself back on the stage. The lights never dimmed, and the microphone never left his hand. He tried to stop singing, but the moment that he lowered the microphone, the clapping would begin again from the first row. Steady, mechanical, and patient. The sound made his skin growl. It was not encouragement. It was in demand. He tried different songs, folk songs from his childhood, cheerful love songs, even a simple children's rhythm. Nothing was satisfying them. The clapping never changed, almost always the same rhythm, always waiting for more. He shouted into the crowd, begging them to tell him what they wanted. The audience did not answer. The paper dolls in the first row sat motionless. The painted smiles on their faces were frozen and their eyes were unblinking. By the third night of the dreams, his voice was rough, I would say. Even when awake, his throat burned as if he had been singing for hours. He told no one, afraid they would laugh or call him foolish, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had taken a picture of something that he's never supposed to see, and now he was being forced to perform for them, for eternity, he thought. And on the fourth night, he finally dared to look directly at the first row. He had avoided their faces before, but this time he could not resist. The dream was too strong and his curiosity was too heavy. The paper dolls sat neatly in their seats, but their faces were no longer the same. The paint looked fresher, darker, as though someone had drawn over them in thick ink. Their smiles had shifted, curving wider, unnatural against their flat skin. They were not joyful smiles. They were patient, knowing smiles, like they had already decided how the dream would end. As he stared, one of the dolls tilted its head ever so slightly, as though acknowledging him. The clapping began again, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls. He dropped the microphone and covered his ears, and the sound filled his head, steady and relentless. He woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. His phone buzzed once on the table, though no message appeared. He didn't touch it. He couldn't bear to see the photograph again. That night, he lit 3 sticks of incense on his balcony and bowed low, whispering apologies into the smoke. But the rhythm of the clapping lingered in his ears long after the incense had burned away. By the 5th night, he couldn't take it anymore. He sat in his room with his phone on the table, the photograph still sitting in his gallery. He had not opened it since that first night, but the weight of it pressed onto him. He knew it was the source, the doorway that he had opened without meaning to. With trembling hands, he unlocked and pulled up the picture one last time. The seats were filled as before, every painted face clear and their smiles sharp under the stage lights. His heart raced as he stared at it, feeling as if the dolls were staring back through the screen. He pressed down hand on the screen and hit delete. The image vanished, replaced by an empty black background. He exhaled sharply as if the air in his chest had been trapped for days. The next evening, before returning to the stage, he lit 3 sticks of incense outside of the performance tent. He bowed low, once for heaven, once for earth, and once for the underworld. He whispered an apology, asking for forgiveness, asking to be left alone. The smoke rose straight into the sky, and for the first time in days, he felt the faintest relief. The show continued through the month, and he still sang at the performance. His voice was weaker now, softer, but he went on because that was his work. The crowd clapped and cheered as they always did, but he never looked at the front row again. He never raised his phone towards the empty chairs, and when the performers laughed about the empty seats, he stayed silent. The photograph was gone, but the memory never fully left him. That night, when the room was silent, he sometimes still heard the faint rhythm of applause, slow and even, as though somewhere those dolls, those paper dolls, were still waiting for another song. Now, he knew why the front row was always left empty. It was not just decoration. It was not just a tradition. It was a seat reserved for the unseen. And once you notice who sits there, you can never unsee it. The singer learned his lesson, and some seats are not meant for the living, and some rules exist because the dead are always listening. But the Hungry Ghost Month holds many warnings, and not all of them are about offerings or empty chairs. Even something as ordinary as your own laundry can also invite trouble if you are careless. And that leads us to our final story. The third story is about a woman who left her clothes outside at night and discovered that they were no longer hers when she tried to take them back. In many households across Asia, elders warn against leaving clothes outside overnight during the Hungry Ghost Month. They say wandering spirits can mistake them for something to wear, and if a spirit takes your clothing, it may come back for you as well. A woman living inside a quiet apartment block thought little of this warning. She had worked late that evening and her laundry still sat damp in the basket. Rather than leaving it unwashed, she hung it out on the balcony under the night sky. Shirts, trousers, and a favorite blouse swayed gently in the warm air. She clipped each piece carefully, not out of fear but habit, and stepped back once the line was full. To her, it was just a simple task, no different from any other day. The street below was silent and the sky was cloudless, and she thought nothing of it as she slid back from the balcony to her bedroom to go to sleep. The next morning came bright and ordinary. She stepped onto the balcony to collect her clothes, but her hands froze on the line. One shirt was missing. The blouse, with a small stitched flower near the hem, the one that she wore more often. She checked the ground below, thinking that the wind must have carried it down. She searched the railing, the stairway, even the bushes downstairs in the parking lot, but the blouse was gone. No one had seen it, and no one had picked it up. The neighbors shook their heads when she asked. Some gave her a strange look, and one old woman muttered, "You shouldn't leave it outside last night." The words unsettled her in some strange way, but she tried to brush them off. It was just a shirt, she told herself. Things get lost. Maybe someone had stolen it. Maybe she misplaced it. But that evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the air grew still, she thought of the empty space on her clothesline and the stitched flower she might never see again. At the back of her head, her grandmother's warning echoed quietly. Never let the spirits borrow what belongs to you. That night, she stayed late at work and returned home when the streets were already quiet. Most shops pulled down their shutters and only the occasional motorbike passed by. She chose a longer route through the neighborhood, one that cut between blocks of apartments and ended near her own building. As she walked, she noticed a figure standing at the far end of the street. It was too thin, too stiff, almost like a cardboard cutout left against the lamppost. At first, she thought it might be just a display from a nearby shop or some leftover decoration from the festival. But there were no shops on the street, and the closer she came, the stranger it looked. The body was narrow, the posture straight and unnatural, and though it didn't move, it seemed to be waiting. When she drew closer, nearer the figure, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was wearing a blouse, a simple fabric with a small stitched flower near the hem. Her blouse, the one that had vanished from her clothesline the night before. The fabric swayed gently, though the air was still. The figure's shoulders were wrong, too sharp, as if the garment hung on something that was not built like a human body. Its head turned just slightly and the angle stiff and jerking, like paper folding instead of a neck moving. She stopped in her tracks. The street behind her was empty and the way forward meant passing directly by the figure. Her grandmother's word came back to her once more. Heavy now. If a spirit wears your clothes, it will not stop at the fabric. It will come back for you. She lowered her gaze, clenched her fist, and forced herself to keep walking. Her steps were slow. Each one was measured as she moved past the figure. She kept her eyes on the ground, too afraid to meet its painted face, but she could feel it's watching her. She noticed that its hands, they didn't look real. They hung stiffly like pieces of card cut into a shape of her fingers. The edge curled slightly as if burned, and they swayed without bending. It was not the way a person's hand should move. She told herself not to run. If it truly was what she feared, running would only invite it to follow. So she passed by, and her jaw was tight and her pulse was racing, pretending that she couldn't see it at all. Later, back in her apartment, she locked the balcony door and drew the curtains tightly shut. She tried to convince herself it was only a trick of her imagination, or maybe even someone playing a cruel prank on her. But the blouse, her blouse, was gone, and she couldn't explain how it had appeared on that figure. She laid in bed, staring at the ceiling until the clock passed midnight. That was when she noticed the curtains moving, swelling inward as if pushed by a breeze. But the door was locked and the air was still. Her chest tightened. A shape stood faintly behind the curtain, tall and unmoving. She could just make out the outline of the shoulders, and near the hem, a tiny flower stitched into the fabric. Her blouse was back, but it was no longer hers. She didn't dare to open the balcony door. Her hands hovered over the handle, but she stopped herself. To see what stood there fully, to let it in, would mean giving it more than it had already taken. Instead, she bowed her head, and her voice shook as she whispered into the dark. "I'm sorry, just please take the blouse if you want it. I'll make something new for you tomorrow. Just leave me alone." The shape behind the curtain didn't move. The fabric of the blouse swayed once, then stilled. And for a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of her own breathing. Then slowly, the curtains fell flat again. The presence was gone. She sat awake until dawn, the lights burning and waiting for the first chance to make things right. When the sun rose, she left her apartment carrying a basin, a plate of fruit, and a fresh slack of paper clothes brought from a temple shop. She walked to a quiet corner near the block of her apartment and placed everything carefully on the ground and lit the paper. The flames rose quickly, curling the folded shapes into black ash. She bowed 3 times and whispered again, promising to respect the rules from now on, promising never to leave her clothes outside at night again, and the smoke rose straight and thin into the clear morning sky. She waited until the last ember faded and returned home without looking back. The blouse was gone, but in its place, she had left something else, an offering, a sign of respect. That night, the balcony stayed quiet. The curtains never moved, and for the first time in days, she was able to sleep. The following morning after her slept, she stepped onto her balcony with cautious eyes. The line was empty, with the peg still clipped in place where the blouse had once hung. For a moment, she feared she might see the figure again at the end of the street, but there was nothing there. She looked down at her hands, still faintly smelling of ash from the offering she had burned the day before. The scent clung to her skin like a reminder. She told herself it was enough, that the spirit had accepted the gift and let her be. Life returned to its rhythm, and she went to work. She came back home, and she walked the same streets. But every time she saw laundry hanging from the other balconies at night, her stomach tightened. She wondered if their owners understood the risk, if they too believed it was only an old superstition during the Hungry Ghost Month. And that is the end of the 3rd story. The Hungry Ghost Month is a time when the living and the dead share the same streets. Families burn offerings to honor their ancestors, and rituals are kept to show respect to wandering spirits. But when those rules are broken, the boundary thins and the consequences can follow you home. One man learned that even ash can hold a face. A performer discovered that empty seats are not always empty, and a woman saw her own clothes borrowed by hands that were never alive. These warnings are not just superstition. They are reminders passed down through generations, rules to keep the living safe and the dead at peace. So, if you ever walk through these streets during the Hungry Ghost Month in Asia, remember the offerings at your feet, the chairs left in the front rows of the performances, and the clothes swaying on a line after dark. Because the dead do not ask much, only respect. And if you forget, they may come to remind you as well.